In 1999, a Japanese man landed at Heathrow Airport with a camera crew, a film permit, and a Toyota Supra that had no business being on a public road. The engine under the bonnet made somewhere between 800 and 1,000 horsepower, depending on which dyno run you believe. The 2JZ had been rebuilt so far past its factory specification that the only thing it still shared with the engine Toyota originally fitted was the basic architecture. Everything else, the turbocharger, the fueling, the management system, had been replaced with hardware designed for a car that was never going to see a dealership. On a public motorway in Northamptonshire, England, in the middle of the night, this car was clocked at 197 miles per hour on a public road, with a camera rolling. The man driving it was arrested. His Japanese driving license was confiscated by Northamptonshire police. He was held, processed, and deported from the United Kingdom. The footage spread through Japanese car media and then, as the internet became what it became, across the world. And the man at the center of it became simultaneously the most famous and the most notorious engine builder his country had ever produced. His name is Kazuhiko Nagata. The world knows him as Smoky. And the story of how he ended up on an English motorway doing 200 miles per hour in a car he built himself is considerably stranger than the arrest. Who Smoky Nagata actually is. Before the UK run, before any of it became legend, there was a young mechanic in Japan with a specific and slightly alarming relationship with how fast cars could go. Kazuhiko Nagata learned engines the practical way, by breaking things and fixing them, accumulating the kind of understanding that comes from years of doing rather than studying. He was working on modified cars before he had a license to drive them. He founded Top Secret in 1992. The name was not ironic. The business operated in a space that Japan's automotive regulations did not exactly encourage. The cars his team was building, heavily modified Supras, Skylines, anything with a platform capable of absorbing serious power, were not built to pass any inspection a government official would approve. They were built to go fast, specifically and exclusively, for an underground tuning and street racing culture in Japan that was real, organized, and operating at a level of seriousness the Western equivalent rarely matched. Japan's street racing culture of the late 1980s and 1990s is not something that gets discussed in polite automotive journalism, but it was real and it was organized. The expressways around Tokyo, the mountain passes, the industrial areas late at night, these were where modified Japanese cars were actually being tested against each other at speeds that the legal limit made illegal immediately, and the structural limits of the roads made genuinely dangerous in ways that most participants understood and proceeded anyway. Nagata built cars for that world, and he was very good at it. By the late 1990s, Top Secret was one of the most respected and most closely watched tuning shops in Japan. Nagata was running out of room, not in the technical sense, in the geographical sense. Japan's roads had limits. The speeds he was chasing were exceeding what those roads in that enforcement environment could accommodate. So he went to England, where a specific stretch of the A1 in Northamptonshire runs straight and level for long enough that a car with the right power to drag ratio can theoretically reach and hold its top speed. What was in that Supra? The car was a Toyota Supra MKIV. The choice was not sentimental. The Supra was the platform because the 2JZ GT was the most tunable engine in Japan's aftermarket at that point, and Top Secret had accumulated more knowledge about what it could sustain than almost anyone else on Earth. The factory engine made around 320 horsepower. What Nagata's team had built into this car was somewhere between 4 and 5 times that, though Nagata has never committed to a precise number in any interview, for reasons that are probably self-evident. The factory sequential twin-turbo system was gone, replaced by a single large-frame turbocharger sized for the power target. The fueling system was rebuilt around larger injectors running a custom map. The connecting rods were forged replacements, the factory items being the limiting factor at this cylinder pressure, with forged pistons running lower compression to accommodate the boost level. The management system was a standalone unit running a map the standard Toyota ECU could not have produced and would not have permitted. High-speed stability mattered too. Suspension geometry adjusted for speed. Tires rated for the velocity. Aerodynamic modifications that at these speeds stopped being cosmetic and started being structural. This was not a weekend build. It represented years of accumulated knowledge and a level of financial investment that most tuning shops never reach. Nagata brought it to England because England had something Japan didn't: a long, straight, at certain hours empty road where that knowledge could be fully expressed. The plan was to film a top-speed run for Japanese car media, a documentary project. The method was a near 200-mile-per-hour pass on a public motorway at night, which existed in a gray zone between performance journalism and what traffic law in most countries would classify as something rather more serious. The run. The arrest. The footage shows what you'd expect: a modified Supra on an empty motorway at night, accelerating through speeds that the camera struggles to convey. The sound is the 2JZ at full boost. At this power level, not a sports car note, but something more industrial, more violent. The sound of combustion events at the absolute upper limit of what the hardware was built to contain. The car reached 197 miles per hour, 317 kilometers per hour, on a public road, with a camera crew following. Northamptonshire police caught up shortly after. What followed was not dramatic in the way that car chases are dramatic. Nagata pulled over. The officers approached. The conversation was, by every account, calm. No aggression. No attempt to flee. A Japanese man in a very fast car being asked to explain himself to officers who were looking at their speed equipment with expressions that suggested they wished the number was different. Nagata was arrested, processed with the unhurried thoroughness that English bureaucracy applies to unusual situations, and subsequently deported. He returned to Japan, where the footage of what he had done was already spreading. In Japan, the response was not what you might expect from a community learning that one of its most prominent members had been deported from a foreign country for dangerous driving. It was closer to the response a community gives someone who has done something genuinely impressive and paid a price for it. Not celebration. Not condemnation. Something more complicated. The speed was real. The consequences were real. The footage was extraordinary. And the debate about what it all meant ran through the tuning community for years. The wider world processed it differently. In 1999, distribution was primarily print media and word of mouth, with the internet just beginning to be the mechanism it would become. But the story had the right shape for viral transmission even before that term existed. A Japanese tuner, a modified Supra, 197 miles per hour on a public road, arrested, deported. The bare facts were enough. The footage, when enough people eventually found it, added the dimension that made it permanent. What the arrest did to Top Secret. Nagata came back to Japan with no driving license. The Japanese one had been confiscated by Northamptonshire police, and a global reputation that the tuning world had not previously granted him. Top Secret was no longer a respected Japanese shop known primarily within Japan's domestic enthusiast community. It was a reference point in the international conversation about modified cars. The arrest, paradoxically, was the most effective marketing Top Secret ever received. Not because Nagata planned it that way. By every account of the man, including his own, the arrest was a consequence he accepted rather than a move he engineered, but the coverage that followed put Top Secret's name in front of audiences that would never have encountered it otherwise. Orders came from outside Japan. Requests for builds arrived from collectors in the United States and Europe, from people who understood that the shop behind the car that did 197 miles per hour on a public road probably knew some things about building engines that most shops didn't. The commercial consequence was that Top Secret became viable at a different scale. The underground reputation that had sustained it through the 1990s had a ceiling. The international reputation the UK run created did not. Nagata went from being Japan's most notorious tuner to being the world's most notorious tuner. And the world's market for extreme modified cars is considerably larger than Japan's. The decade after the arrest saw Top Secret build some of the most extreme Nissan R34 GTR builds outside of factory motorsport. 1,000-horsepower cars sitting at the intersection of extreme performance and road legality that the shop had always occupied, now documented and distributed to a global audience. Nagata never recalibrated. The arrest did not produce in him the kind of reflection that such experiences sometimes produce. He continued building cars to limits and then finding out what those limits actually were. He became the kind of figure the tuning world produces occasionally, someone whose entire identity is so completely aligned with a single obsession that external consequences don't redirect it. What the 2JZ did, Here's the part that gets lost in the mythology of the man and the run and the arrest. The car reached 197 miles per hour on a public road in England, and then it was driven back. The engine did not fail. The turbocharger did not fail. The fueling system did not fail. On a public motorway, at a speed that most racing cars of that era would have respected, a modified street car built in a tuning shop in Chiba Prefecture ran cleanly and came back intact. That is the 2JZ's contribution to this story. Not just the power, the survival. The fact that the engine Nagata built to reach that speed could sustain it long enough for the numbers to be real, and then return home without leaving a trail of components across Northamptonshire. It is worth understanding what that means technically. At 197 miles per hour, the engine is producing power in the range of 600 horsepower at the wheels to overcome aerodynamic drag alone. That load sustained continuously demands a fuel system, a cooling system, an oiling system, and a bottom end that are all operating within their design limits simultaneously. Any weakness in any of those systems ends the run. The 2JZ had no weaknesses that night. The 2JZ's reputation in Japan was already established by 1999. This run established it internationally. When people discuss why the 2JZ became the global reference point for modified engine reliability at extreme outputs, the benchmark that everything else gets measured against in enthusiast communities, the top secret Supra is part of that conversation. A visible, documented, footage exists part of it. Smoky Nagata is still in Chiba. Top Secret is still open. The shop that a deportation order from the British government made internationally famous is still producing some of the most extreme modified vehicles in Japan, run by a man whose relationship with the concept of an appropriate speed limit has not visibly moderated in the quarter century since Northamptonshire police introduced themselves. The Supra from the run still exists and has been modified further since 1999, which tells you something about how Nagata relates to cars that have already done something remarkable. A remarkable thing is not a reason to stop. It's a reason to find out what comes next. The story of Smoky Nagata is not ultimately about a single run, or a single arrest, or a single night in England. It's about what happens when an obsession with how fast an engine can go meets every external structure that exists to tell you it shouldn't go that fast. Nagata spent his career finding out what was on the other side of that meeting. The answer he arrived at on a public road in Northamptonshire in 1999 was 197 miles per hour. He was arrested for it. He was deported for it. And then he went home and built a faster one.